I will ping along the links to the we're recording now. I will ping along the links to the recording when we get to the end of the day, so you've got access to that, which I hope will be useful. Right. Sorry, just gonna set my screen up in the best possible light. Okay. Good. I'm there. Okay, so what I want to do is I want to pick up when we're getting to the point that the patient is feeling calmer about food. They've got more ability to understand what I eat has got something to do with what happens to my weight. So they're relearning that balance. They're trying out different foods. We'll probably have them doing behavioral experiments for several weeks with different foods in the background to a lot of the rest of what we're doing. But we're now shifting the emphasis. And we're shifting into those things that the patients often wanted to be dealing with from the beginning. There's two of those. They might both be relevant. It might just be one or the other. But the first of those, it was working with emotional triggers and core beliefs. So I'm going to take us through that, give you an idea about what kind of thing we'll be doing. I'm then going to move on to body image, because body image is important in terms of stopping relapse. But there's also a little bit in the middle where I'm going to talk about cue exposure. And that isn't directly related to either of these, but it's an important little skill to add in when it comes to thinking there might be a few additional binges that we need to get rid of. So if you remember, I talked earlier about binges being things where we start out by assuming it's about starvation, unless we can see good reason not to. We then think any that we can't deal with by getting the eating straight are more likely to be emotional. But then sometimes you get this kind of annoying little binge left over, which doesn't appear to be related to emotion, doesn't appear to be related to starvation, but it's often about what the patient will call habit. And in those cases, there's a very specific bit of learning they might have done. So I'll talk about cue exposure after I've talked about working with emotional triggers, because the order of events is start with getting the eating straight, move on to the emotions, and if that hasn't got rid of all of the binges, then we think cue exposure. So that's what I've got in mind here. We'll end up after the coffee break, obviously, we'll end up with coming back to how we prevent relapse, kind of important stuff, and that's where we'll do the review of what we've achieved with the patient. But that's the structure I've got for the afternoon anyway. Okie dokie. Let me just move my slides on by one. This is usually stuff that we do over maybe three sessions, maybe four at a pinch, and where we're aiming to get to the kind of best resolution we can in the simplest possible way. So we don't really start working with emotions until we're clear that the person's eating straight. Remember what I said about serotonin? If you try working with somebody whose biology is out, then their mood is going to be unstable anyway. So when you start thinking, well, maybe then I need to work with their mood, that can go away by the time that you see the patient for this stage, because of the eating differently. So remember, get the eating as straight as you can. And that's particularly around carbohydrates. I've often used this example, which was such a brilliant case. A patient of mine who I worked with some years ago, and I mean, her name was Steph, and when she came to us, I think I was her seventh therapist, with no failure to attend the therapy or do the therapy, just none of them had ever worked before. And then when we talked about this, my first suggestion was, why don't we try getting you to eat differently? Now, she had an 8-year history of bulimia nervosa and borderline personality disorder. So I thought, wow, this is going to be quite a complex one to work with, given how long, how many therapies, etc. Actually, after she ate, after about 4 sessions, we never saw the bulimia, and the borderline features just faded away too. So in other words, all the emotionally driven impulsivity was about the starvation in her case. And that was despite the fact she'd had a pretty crappy childhood. Yeah, so you could easily have said, oh, well, it's trauma, it's childhood, etc. But that would have been to kind of forget the fact that actually the biology will trump an awful lot if we're not careful about keeping an eye on it. So we do this if it's necessary. If the eating straight at the beginning, so for example, the patient with binge eating disorder, if they eat pretty well at the beginning, but they also binge, then it can be a good thing to start at this phase. But let's find out whether they do or not, rather than assuming it must just be emotional. We're too ready to leap to that sometimes. And I'm a psychologist. I know what it's like. We're some of the worst ones for doing that. Also, look out for whether the story adds up. This is a common thing in supervision, I find. Someone will come to me and will say, that patient is eating fine and they're binging. We need to move on to the emotions. And my normal reaction is, are they gaining weight? Because if they're eating fine and they're binging, they should be gaining weight. And if it turns out actually their weight hasn't moved, then maybe they're not eating enough in the first place. So let's just double check that first. But when we know that the person is eating enough, when we know that there's not going to be a big biological reason, then we can start working on that emotionally driven stuff, the residual binging and compensatory behaviors. And it's important we understand those, where they come from, etc., because now we're not going into those kind of negative automatic thoughts about food or dysfunctional assumptions, one more likely if I put weight on. We're getting into core belief material. Now, if you're not familiar with them, core beliefs is a term that gets used for beliefs that are, if you like, personality level. They are who I am. I am a failure. Not if I don't do well at this, I will be a failure. That's more a dysfunctional assumption, a conditional belief. This is the I am a failure. Total, absolute, it's who I am. It's who I always will be. That's the kind of belief that we're talking about. And of course, what happens is people try to deal with those emotions, those beliefs in ways that look good in the short term, but don't work longer term. The point that we always have to raise with our patients is emotions serve a function. They trigger us to behave in particular ways that are appropriate. So if I'm lonely, I want to pick up the phone and talk to someone. If I'm happy, I want to do the same thing again. If I'm anxious, I want to resolve the situation. That's what an emotion is signaling for me to do, to change in some way that resolves that emotion in a way that works for me. However, if we can't do that, we're left with the emotional arousal. And that's when you start seeing impulsive and compulsive behaviors. I've got the unpleasant emotional arousal. I don't know how to deal with it. All I can do is find a way of getting rid of the arousal by, for example, drinking, going for a run, binging, self-harm, whatever it might be. So you've got impulsive behaviors like binging and vomiting. And then you've got compulsive behaviors like OCD, restriction, exercise, etc. So you'll hit both of those within our patient group. So why on earth would we discount or ignore emotions? This is where it's important to start understanding the person, where they've come from. When we see impulsive behavior, it's usually, I've got an emotion, can't tolerate it, get rid of it. It's a safety behavior, in other words. Short term, like I don't want to feel bad about my weight from last night, so I won't eat breakfast this morning. Longer term, you get a negative outcome from that. And then you've got your compulsive behaviors, which is where you avoid that emotion ever getting triggered. So going for a run, avoidance, in other words. Those things they're based on the idea that emotions have become aversive. This goes back to Marshall and invalidation of emotions. And she describes it as communication of emotions ignored or responded to negatively. When you show negative affect or individual identity, it's not tolerated. You're meant to be happy, put a smiley face, positive mental attitude. So when your trainee comes along saying, I think it's about emotions, talk to them about why those emotions have developed. It's really, really important to see. And you see this underlying probably the bulk of trauma experiences, but particularly things like neglect and emotional abuse. You commonly see it starting in childhood. That's really relevant because we code information differently, as I'll go on to talk about. And you often see it repeated, though, in adult relationships. Think about people you know or patients you have worked with who seem to pick the weirdest possible partners who aren't going to be good for them anyway whatsoever. That may be because you feel more comfortable in that kind of relationship. A former colleague of mine, lovely woman, really, really lovely, but she and her partner had met because they were both into exercise. They'd met at the gym, and that was what they had in common. And when she started wanting something a bit more emotional content, she realized that what she'd done was pick the least emotional person in the world, because that was what she felt comfortable with at the time. So you need to be thinking there's a reason that people find emotion aversive. They grow up in an environment that can be invalidating, but sometimes they get into further relationships that worsen that state. It's not a matter of choice. It's just a matter of this is what I know and feel comfortable with. The kind of developmental family type. So about, this is that invalidating emotional environment. We all want the patient who has had a validating family. They support your emotions. They listen to you, your emotions, and say, okay, I get it. I respond appropriately. We all love that kind of family. Unfortunately, and this is very callous of them, these are the kind of people who often get by without the need for therapy. Deeply unreasonable of them, I know. So the validating family we don't see so often. We do see the typical family, the family where they're always control your emotions. We focus on success. We focus on achievement. We don't talk about the bad stuff. I always think about this in terms of, the family that's made good and doesn't ever want it to go away. They don't want to be disgraced by their child. They don't want to lose social standing, etc. So everything is absolutely positive. It's got to be positive the whole time with no emotions being shown. And then you've got the perfect family where there's active discouragement of anything negative. We don't do anger, we don't do upset, we don't do fear. It's okay to do happy. You can be chirpy, but we don't do negative. If you're familiar with, this is a cultural touchstone for me. I can refer almost anything back to this, but if you're familiar with The Simpsons, a television program, this is the Flanders family. This is the neighbors of The Simpsons who don't do negative in any way whatsoever. Then you've got The Simpsons themselves, the chaotic family, where emotions are difficult because you're going to get strangled rather than get supported, or where you've got, in the case of The Simpsons, a mother who is, has her own edgy issues as well. You see emotional disturbance between family members. There might be alcohol, there might be anger at requests for any kind of support or whatever. In any of those three types, typical, perfect, or chaotic, what do you learn? Emotions aren't safe. It's not safe to express or even have an emotion. That's not a good thing. I promise you that is not a good thing. What's the impact? Well, if you think in terms of Jeff Young's work, what you see developing is this emotional inhibition belief. And this is really important. Because if your belief from childhood is quite appropriate, in other words, it's not a maladaptive belief, it's a very adaptive belief. I grew up believing that emotions were not safe things. We don't do emotions for whatever reason. Then, of course, we start thinking emotions being triggered as a threat. So we go into those behaviors. We exercise, we restrict, or we suppress the emotions. We binge, we vomit, anything that helps us deal with emotions when we firmly believe that we are not entitled to or should not experience or express any emotion. That's quite a big pile of crap to get stuck in, but it's one that you'll see many times with the patients that you work with. I'm going to talk about how we address this by starting to dig below the emotion more towards the core belief. What we want to do when we're working with emotions, normalize it for the patient. We want the patient to end up thinking not that emotions are bad things or we should suppress them, but that they're things that are perfectly okay. Now here, DBT, I like DBT a lot. What it teaches you, though, I think is only part of the story. And I remember Marshall Linehan talking about this once, saying DBT is not a therapy on its own. It's how you get people into a therapy effectively. But people keep forgetting that one. So what DBT teaches you is how to tolerate and to behave without using your emotions to drive you. In other words, I can see it coming, I can see the urge, I'm going to do something different. So lots and lots of positives about that. What it doesn't do is help you to address the underlying belief system. In other words, you're still stuck with I'm holding on, rather than I don't need that emotion, or I can deal with the world in a way that gives me more positive emotion. So what we do in CBT is we work with emotions using relatively quick and, as much as possible, simple methods. And we go for more complex if we need to. So we start with Occam's razor. We want to start with approaches to emotions that are fairly quick and easy to apply for the patient. And if that doesn't work, we make things more complicated. So the model we start out with is this. If you're not familiar with a Newton's cradle, it's there on the left. And you'll notice that what you see is there's a ball on the left, it swings down, and the ball on the right pops up. And all the balls in the middle appear to do nothing. They appear to be kind of passive elements of the whole picture. Now, there's two lies I just told you there. Lie number one, the balls in the middle actually are necessary. If you take those out, the whole thing stops working. The other lie I told you was it goes left to right, because it doesn't. It goes right to left as well. So let's think about what that looks like. On the right, you've got that little diagram that we draw out for the patient. I'll put this on the whiteboard. And let's say it's a patient who's binging. What I'll do is say, look, we know that you binge. We know it's not about starvation, but you're not sure what it is about. So what we're going to try to do is work it out. The minute you hear the word habit, you should be thinking, right, let's get drawing a diagram. So let's say the patient binges. I'll draw a little thing at the end saying binges on the right-hand side. And then I'm going to draw out the other circles. And I'm going to start with the one on the left is your trigger. Now you've got the trigger, then you've got some stuff in the middle, then you've got the behavior. You may only need that level of understanding. More commonly, you're going to need the stuff in the middle. So then I'll say, well, what's happening looks like it's the trigger activates your beliefs activate your emotion. You use the binging or other behavior to block out that emotion. You don't feel you can cope with the emotion, so you block it out. So what we want people to be able to, obviously, is to slow that whole process down. To be able to say, well, okay, there's a trigger, and that might make me feel a particular way by activating a particular set of beliefs. Do I actually have to then do that behavior? Do I have to binge? Whatever it might be. So that's one lesson we want people to learn, that in the middle of that diagram on the left, there's a whole set of balls that really matter, the kind of transmitters. And in the case on the right, it's about your core beliefs, the who I am beliefs, and your emotions. So this is what we use to explain what's going on to our patient. But we also address my second lie from earlier on, which is making it clear that the arrows might point left to right, but actually it goes the other way around. If you look at the diagram, or sorry, the illustration on the left, the ball on the right is coming down and knocking out the ball on the left as well. So what we have to stress is, while we think about it in terms of a trigger, activates a belief, activates an emotion, activates a behavior, actually that behavior, you binging, is going to make me feel worse about myself, hits my emotions. That's going to make me feel worse, and it's going to affect my core beliefs. That in turn, it makes the trigger more likely. So we have to make it clear to people, this is a maintaining cycle if we're not careful. If our safety behavior is don't sit with your emotion, but use a behavior to block it, or avoid it in whatever way you wish to, then you're likely to always be stuck with having that emotion, because you never try to change the structure of that Newton cradle. Any questions about that? Anything people want to query about that use of that model? Because we like nice simple formulations here. You'll notice we don't go for a whole big case formulation. We go for energy graphs, we go for hot cross buns, we go for Newton's cradles, etc. Any questions about that particular little mini formulation? Nope. Okay then. So what do we actually do? Well, We talk to the patient about that perpetuation, about the way that the trigger can be made more likely if we don't actually do something about breaking this pattern. And then we start talking about what are we actually going to do? What can we do to help the person deal with their emotions? Well, number one is to formulate it, to explain it. I've had patients who, when they've seen that kind of diagram, have gone, oh, so if I just sit with my emotion, it'll be okay? Well, we can find out, can't we? We don't know, but we can find out. The next is using diaries to identify the emotional trigger. There's a copy of this diary on the website where we look at potential triggers to use the unhealthy behaviors. And what we do is we ask the person to keep the record as they go from the point where they get the urge to eat or the urge to behave in a particular way, all the way through to what do I want to do? What's my decision going to be? And one thing, by the way, the longer you can make the person sit there, the more exposure you're doing. So I'll come back to that one in a little bit. So I've had plenty of patients over the years who've said to me something as sort of straightforward as, "Oh, I don't like diaries. If I have to keep diaries, I'm not going to binge." To which my response is, "Well, that sounds like a good outcome to me. Let's give it a try." And lo and behold, often it just needs that little self-awareness to stop them from using the behavior. After that, though, we need to start changing things. We need to start changing triggers. We need to start changing responses, so response prevention, and we need to address core beliefs. Those are the biggies that we've got left here. So I'm going to work my way through those. Again, there's plenty of videos on the site to go look at how that's done. So let's start by targeting the trigger. If you're familiar with habit reversal, this should seem like a doddle. So what we're doing is saying, can I identify what the trigger is for the state, even if I can't even identify what the state is? If you hear the term, it's just a habit, then start thinking, okay, can we work out the trigger? Habit reversal is a very straightforward method. As you'll see, it's used in a number of different problems. First book was the one at the top there, the Asrin and Nunn book, Habit Control in a Day. And the really worrying bit is that for some of the habits they talk about, you do get really quick effects. I certainly use this with patients with, for example, trichotillomania, they're pulling their hair, etc., or picking at their skin. And what you're doing here is finding an alternative behavior that doesn't fit with the behavior that you're using. So firstly, even though we can't identify the emotion, you identify the behavior and you identify an incompatible action. So the patient says to you, it's just a bad habit. I vomit sometimes, but I couldn't do it with other people around. Then you already start to get incompatible actions, aren't you? You already start to say, oh, in that case, when you get the urge to vomit, maybe it'll be a good time to actually phone a friend or go out into the street and say hello to somebody. So you've identified an incompatible behavior. Being with other people means I can't use my negative or problematic behavior. Great, let's do that then. Next step I want to is look at the awareness of when the problem is likely to happen. What time of day, where, what situation am I in? It happens when I'm on my own at home at 6 o'clock in the evening. I get this urge to use a particular behavior like binge, for example. Okay, what can we do about that? Well, again, we could say, take an extra half hour to walk home so you don't get home on your own. Make sure that there's somebody else there at the time. Stop at a friend's on the way. Anything that's incompatible that will stop the target behavior happening. So if somebody says, I vomit because basically it's just a habit, then start saying, okay, when you get the urge, I want you to go for a walk. I want you to visit a friend, make a phone call, anything that is not compatible with that behavior, not compatible with the vomiting. I always enjoy these little chats after lunch. And what we're looking for, of course, is that urge. How strong is your urge to be sick? Well, it's fairly high. Out of 10. Oh, it's an 8. Let's keep monitoring it. And after about 10, 15 minutes, we start finding the urge goes down. So what we're doing is we're teaching people, if I use an alternative behavior, the urge goes down. And notice right now we have no understanding about why they've got the urge, etc. We're not looking back at the history. We're just saying, how do we cope with it in the here and now? That will work for some people. So it's always worth thinking, what are the incompatible behaviors here? Then we'll actually start bringing in the emotional stuff. And I'm going to start out with how we identify, and then move on specifically to anxiety, and then move on to other emotions after that. So first thing, what do you think someone else might have felt in that situation? Here's a checklist. How were you feeling in that situation in your diary? If you can't work it out, how would somebody else be feeling? And once you worked it out, just put a little tick against, I was feeling angry, or I was feeling ashamed, whatever it might be, and get the person better at identifying that emotional expression, or the emotional experience rather, as they go through the week. What tells you that you're angry? What tells you that you're upset? Well, I can always feel my nostrils flaring and my muscles tensing up if I'm angry. Okay, so when you feel those things, tick it off. Make it clear that that's probably the emotion that you're experiencing, even if you're not aware of it. And here's where we will move on to exposure. Now, exposure in the case of anxiety, for pretty much anything apart from the stuff I'm going to talk about with cue exposure, exposure for just about anything is about not using the safety behavior. It's about facing the thing that you're afraid of and don't use your safety behavior. So I feel anxious. My safety behavior, binge. Okay. What's that going to do for me? It's going to make me feel good for 30 seconds. And then I'm going to start thinking, oh shit, I binged. I feel like a terrible person, etc. So what we want the person to do is to learn, if you don't use safety behavior, i.e. the binging or the vomiting or whatever it might be, if you don't use the safety behavior, then your anxiety goes away anyway. And that's the thing that you never learn, of course, with safety behaviors. Your anxiety never goes down. Your anxiety never goes down naturally. It goes down when you run away or when you use the behavior. My favorite is always working with panic disorder and, knowing that the thing that will make the patient feel safest right now is to run out of the room. And that's also the thing that would be most counter-therapeutic, because then they never learn. Actually, the panic would have gone down anyway. So the longer you can sit with the emotion, 30 minutes is a pretty good time. The longer you can sit with it, the better. But you need to be aware of that emotion. If you're using distraction at all, make it something like a big, big diary so that you're still focused on the topic. You're just distracting from the behavior. Any alternative incompatible behavior will be good. But you need to avoid using things that will calm the patient down. And I know there's always that temptation. There's always that kind of, oh God, I really want to calm the patient down. I feel guilty. I feel responsible, etc., etc. Actually, all that you're doing is stopping them learning that the emotion would have disappeared of its own accord. So what am I recommending? Don't try using things like relaxation, mindfulness, self-compassion in this context. I have no problem with those things in appropriate context, but right here, they limit the effect of the exposure. So what I want my patient to do is, if possible, I want them to sit with the emotion for 30 minutes without going vomiting, for example. Ideally, what I want them to do is to spend 30 minutes sitting there, talking about it, examining their own body, making it clear that they're aware of themselves. Keep focus on the anxiety until you learn it goes away. Because the more you focus on it, the more intently you do that, the better the impact of the exposure therapy. So key thing, just like exposure around food, we want to avoid the safety behavior. And if we can do that, great. But here's a problem. Not all emotions respond in the same way to exposure therapy. Horrible though it is to admit it, there are some things where that's just not a very good idea. The biggest one is when the emotion is about anger or when it's about shame. Those are the two really big ones because they're much more likely to trigger a bulimic behavior, and they don't really respond well to exposure therapy. Why not? If I've got a patient who's anxious, it's very internal. I can get them to focus on that anxiety. We can spend half an hour talking about it. I can get them to record something that they can bring in to show they did the same over the week. And the anxiety tends to fade. There is a problem, particularly with anger, but also with shame. We don't let it go. So, as I'm fond of saying, imagine you're driving down the motorway. For me, the M1. I'm driving down the M1. Pick another motorway of your own choice. And someone cuts me up badly. They swing their car straight in front of me so they can get off the motorway at the next junction. Really quite dangerous. That pisses me off. Now, what we tend to find is that people rehearse anger. With anxiety, you tend to let it go. With anger, you tend to be going, bloody hell, did you see that person who cut me up? Did you see how bad that was? There's no one in the car. I'm talking to myself. I'm going to ring someone and tell them how badly I've been cut up, etc. And you get home and you're still moaning about how badly someone cut you up and should I call the police, etc., etc. In other words, the verbal rehearsal around anger and likewise around shame, oh my God, I feel so bad about this, are things that keep the emotion going. So exposure doesn't work terribly well with those emotions. And that's because we're into core belief territory here. We're starting to get to those beliefs people have about themselves that are not just about the immediate situation. They're about who I am. Any questions about that before I start talking about those core beliefs? No? Okay. So I'm going to give you a couple of examples as I go through this. So hopefully this will illustrate what I'm talking about. Firstly, where exposure isn't effective, then we start working with core beliefs. And this, I'm usually, if I tried the more simple methods, I'm usually onto this method by about, the second session, because the simple ones really are relatively simple to do. So I want to identify that, exposure didn't work or that it was the wrong kind of emotion to be working with. Core belief work breaks down. This is early work by Jeff Young, but it also has a relationship with the work of Jeff Beck. What am I talking about? Tim Beck. Jeff Beck, guitarist, completely different person. Ignore me. So first thing that I'm going to do is I'm going to review the core beliefs. I'm going to find out what they are. I might use a little sheet that we've got here. We give people this and we talk about the central beliefs and the compensatory ones. So, do I feel continually vulnerable? Do I feel broken? Do I trust people? Do I think people are going to leave me? Do I feel like a failure? And then beliefs like I shouldn't show my emotions, or I should be perfect in every way possible. Again, we get patients to identify which beliefs seem to be around for them by just keeping a record of when they identify themselves having those kind of beliefs. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to look at the history of those beliefs for the patient. So say a patient comes out with a pattern of beliefs which is really causing them problems in terms of their eating because it's triggering such emotions. I want to understand why those beliefs made sense in the first place. In other words, the belief you develop is usually adaptive. It relates to the situation that you grew up in over time when you were young. And that has a real impact on the way that we form up the belief into this kind of what Chris Bruin used to call an encapsulated belief. More of that in a few minutes. So I want to understand your beliefs. Where did they come from? What were the origins? Can we help the person to realize that the beliefs they developed made sense in the past? And then can we review whether those beliefs are still useful now? Because what tends to happen is the world around you changes, but you hold on to your beliefs. And if you hold on to your beliefs, then they start becoming problematic. Now, I'm going to give you two examples, okay? Neither of them is a particularly nice one, but I'm going to give you two examples anyway. One of somebody who was quite restrictive, but had some bulimic features, one of whom was straightforwardly bulimic. And I'll come back to those as I go along. So first example, Jenny. Okay, now Jenny, she's a 46-year-old woman. She's had an eating disorder for most of her life. And she also has a major problem around not just restricting, but also exercising. And what happens is she tries not to eat. She exercises all day, basically walking. She would walk. We put a pedometer onto her, and with her knowledge, we don't just strap these things on. And we worked out she was walking something like 40, 45 miles a day, which is quite a long way. And she was also holding down a part-time job, which made it even more impressive stroke scary. And what was happening was she was starving so much that by the time she got home, she ended up binging. And, she was the only person I ever heard of who would get through 2 packs of butter just to go with some bread, because that was the only way she could get enough calories. Anyway, Jenny had 2 really big beliefs. One of which was that no one cared about her. No one cared about her, and no one ever would care about her. Her second belief was, I mustn't ever get in the way of other people, and particularly emotionally. So she was very emotionally inhibited. So we've got these 2 big patterns of belief. Where did they come from? Now you might think, well, that sounds like a weird thing to do. I mean, this all went back to when she was age 6. That's a weird set of beliefs. Actually, they weren't weird. They made perfect sense in the original context. She was about 6. She was the youngest kid in the family by quite a few years. What came up after a little bit of talking about it? She, at the age of 6, had a father. The whole family were living on a farm. Most of the kids were old enough to work on the farm. And the father started to die of cancer. So not only was she distressed about the fact that the father was dying of cancer, but also everybody else started doing other things. So they started looking after the farm. They started looking after Dad. And what they had was this 6-year-old who had absolutely no place in either of those 2. And she felt that she was in the way. And reality, she probably was fairly in the way. Her way of dealing with that was to go out, go for a walk for a while. And she would find that, while she was out for the walk, she wasn't feeling as bad about her father. So she would go for a longer walk, and a longer and a longer and a longer walk. And in the end, she was walking 40 miles and would come home, and it was like nobody had noticed she'd been gone. She'd come back after dark, 6-year-old child, and really everyone was so exhausted or so busy with other things, she could just walk through the door and no one had noticed she hadn't been there. It's not hugely surprising that she develops 2 beliefs out of this, one of which is no one seems to care. Totally understandable. The other is, I must cut myself off. I must isolate myself. She also had quite a lot of trouble with emotions, but I'll stick with the social isolation and the nobody cares side of things for the moment. Again, those beliefs made perfect sense when she was that age. And for several years after, while Dad was dying and the farm still needed running, it just became really commonplace for her to be out the house all day long. And like I say, when you're young, you don't represent things in a kind of nice, verbal, cognitive, logical kind of way. You represent things much more emotionally and perceptually. You see this in PTSD as well. Chris Bruin talks about it. The notion of that encapsulated memory. So her memory of all this wasn't in a kind of logical way. I could talk to her about it and she'd still say, but it feels like I was in the way. When she started talking like that, I realized, actually, I'm using the wrong language. I'm trying to get at this the wrong way round. So I'll come back to what we did later on, but hopefully it makes sense why Jenny would have developed those kind of core beliefs, because they made sense. The other case I want to talk about, who is more straightforwardly bulimic, is Karen. Now, Karen, lovely woman, 28 years old, had a youngster, had a partner, and she would describe how every Friday night she would try to get the partner to leave her. She would try to get rid of him. She'd say, go away, go out with your friends, just don't bother coming back, etc. And she was always amazed when he did come back. And talking to her, it was really clear that she cared about him, but she thought that he was going to leave. So what we had was two things. One, big emotional inhibition belief. She couldn't talk to him about how she was feeling. Number two, big fear of abandonment. A couple of those, Jeff Young type beliefs. Huge, great fear of abandonment. People will leave me. So what she was trying to do was to control her boyfriend leaving by saying, "That's it, out you go. Go off with your floozy or whatever." We have no evidence that was ever a floozy, by the way. But go on, off you go with your mates, etc. Don't bother coming back. In short, pro-schematic behaviours. She would do things keep the schema likely to be going on. Sorry, just letting Torin. So where did Karen's belief come from? Again, time to talk to your patient. Always useful to do so. So where Karen's beliefs had come from was when she was aged about 5, and she had a younger brother aged 3, and they lived with their mum. Dad had disappeared at some point. Never clear what happened there. She was only 5. He'd gone well before that. Anyway, back to her point. Here we are. We've got a little threesome living together, etc. Mum, Karen, brother. Mum finds a guy, and clearly besotted with him, but he happens to live a couple of 100 miles away, so they can't meet very often. And Mum is really frustrated by that. This is going off what Karen remembers Mum talking about. And so one Saturday morning, Karen wakes up, or is woken up, I think, by her mum about 7 o'clock. And Mum says, "Look after your brother. Don't let him get upset. I'm just going out for a little bit. I'll be back very shortly." She thought Mum was going down to the shops to get something or something of that sort. Mum comes back at 7 o'clock that evening. By this time, of course, Karen's absolutely convinced, the worst has happened. Mum is dead. They've been abandoned, etc. She wouldn't have been able to put it like that, but that's her belief about what's going to be happening to her. And then Mum was doing this every weekend and stretching it. So it got to the point where Mum would disappear, early on Friday evening, wouldn't come back till Sunday afternoon. And of course, Karen is beside herself with this, okay, that's it. That's the last time I'll ever see my mum. The sense of responsibility for a younger brother, 3-year-old brother, and she's in charge of him. And her job, remember, is to make sure he's not upset. That's the job she's been given by Mum. And this goes on for a considerable period of time. About a year later, when Mum's still going away most weekends, they get found out. And the police get called. And the police get called, take them away, ring up Mum. Mum comes down, apologises profusely, "Never happened again, officer," and takes him out and then slaps Karen on the face, says, "Don't ever tell on this again," and then goes back to doing exactly what she'd been doing before. I would invite you to come up with a scenario where that doesn't involve a fear of abandonment and an emotional inhibition belief, because not only had Karen been emotionally inhibited around not upsetting her brother, she had to be the strong one. Aged 5 or 6, she had to be the one looking after her brother. But not only that, but also the one time there was a chance to make it good, Mum's reaction was a very hostile one. So that's where it made sense. That was where having that core belief made absolute sense back then. But of course, if you develop a core belief in a very emotional, perceptual kind of framework, changes to your verbal, cognitive kind of understanding of the world don't actually have much of an effect on that. This is a thing that's been talked about a lot in PTSD, and this is where some of the imagery scripting stuff I'll talk about comes from as well, that you can't access those very perceptual emotional representations in standard cognitive ways because we're using the wrong language, if you like. Does that make sense to people? Okay, I see a couple of nods. I'll go with that. So the first step is historical review. Your beliefs made sense. Now it's, do they make sense now? And this is the point where you need to say to the patient, so what seems to be happening is the world has changed, but you've held on to those beliefs, and those beliefs have gone from being useful to being non-useful. They've gone from being helpful to you to being a problem. So Karen's belief mum won't be back is probably a pretty safe one to go with if you've got absolutely no sense of control over the situation. But now her belief had turned into anyone important to me emotionally will go. Therefore, she's trying to get rid of her boyfriend because she can't stop it happening. She can only control the timing. So those are the first two steps that I'd be wanting to do. Very verbal, very chatty in the room. And then the final cognitive bit of this is where I start looking at the attributions. So why do you think your mum did that? Why do you think your mum would leave you and your brother like that? Or, why do you think the family had no time for you? So we look at the core belief and we start trying to identify, was the problem about you or was the problem about someone or something else? So if you remember attribution theory, the big problem comes when you take bad things and say they're all my fault and good things are just chance. And that's what both Karen and Jenny had done. What we're looking for, of course, is to bring in that more kind of normal human bias, which is good things happen, it's about me. Bad things happen, I was just unlucky. So what we're doing is we're trying to challenge that normal pattern of belief system. And to do that, I'm going to be talking to her about, so why do you think mum did this? Why do you think mum, going back to Karen, why do you think mum would have gone off like that? Why do you think she would have reacted at the time? Do you think it's possible that there were reasons for acting that way that weren't about you being a problem? Now, I'm sitting here thinking already, well, of course it can't be a 6-year-old who's created her mum going away. This is mum making a decision to go away. And I can see that with my adult eyes. And I think I'm probably right most of the time with that. But from her point of view, she's still got that very young child perception. It's still very emotional, very perceptual, but it isn't very cognitive. So me talking to her cognitively may not get anywhere. Sometimes it will. Sometimes you get the person going, oh, well, maybe that wasn't my fault after all. And it's kind of like you think, how could you not have thought that before? And sometimes you can use some kind of dirty tricks, if you like. One of my favorite ones is, around someone who's, for example, been abused. This goes back to Derek Jehu's work for anyone with that long a memory. And what Derek Jehu would do would be get you to think, okay, why were you abused? Was it because you somehow created it? Or was it because this other person wanted something from you? He talked a lot about sexual abuse. They talk about, so, the fact that your stepfather said to you, you're enjoying this, aren't you? And would say, you've got to ask me to do this to you. Doesn't actually mean you wanted to. It just means that at that time they had all the control. So sometimes you can do this and you play the dirty card, which is, so if your child said that to you, if your child said, oh, it was my fault, I must have created it, would you buy that? Would you say, yes, it's your fault to your child? To which the answer almost every time has been, no, of course I wouldn't. And okay, so where would you lay the blame? Oh, the blame would be on the guy who did the abusing. Okay, so you can do it for someone else. Now let's think about your scenario. And that's when you'll often get people going, oh, yeah, I suppose I hadn't thought about it like that. I did once have a mum who came back to me saying, I would blame my child for this. But she was somebody with really quite serious personality issues going on. And I don't think we realised that for a few weeks after that. But otherwise, generally speaking, the attribution work, if anything cognitive is going to work, it's getting the person to think, maybe it wasn't me that was responsible for this. However, as I say, when your memory is very encapsulated and not really coded verbally, there are often times when that doesn't work. Again, I'd refer you back to what I said earlier. This is big stuff in the PTSD literature. It's big in the PTSD literature because it's something where if you've got PTSD, it's usually arisen out of something that was unexpected and totally uncontrollable and could not be foreseen in any way, which is why things like imagery scripting get used for PTSD amongst combat veterans, for example, because they didn't have a chance to code anything verbally. It's much more, oh my God, that's the experience, that's my perception of it, etc. So that takes us on to imagery rescripting. Now, imagery rescripting is a technique that is used a lot in PTSD, but we also use it quite a bit in eating disorders, and there are two different ways of using it. I'm going to talk about the first one now, and I'll come back to the second one after the break. So with imagery rescripting, what we're doing is we're taking the person through the image of what happened to them. So again, very, very visual, lots of emotional stuff brought in. And then we're going to go back and we're going to do it again with a different scripted ending. So the first time, we just want to learn what happened to you from your perspective. Second time, not just what happened to you, but can we change that at the end? And the way we do it is we get the person to imagine that they're the young them again and go through the image of the negative event. And then we get them to do the same thing the second time, but the second time we want them to do something slightly different. Second time around, what we want them to do is to want them to go through the same event with the child perspective, but then at a critical point, which will agree with them, want to stop and bring their adult self in. Now, different people have different ways of doing this. There are different protocols, and I really don't mind which you use. I'm just going to give you the one that we do. But our protocol is very much you bring the adult you into it. Some people, Myra Cooper suggests, no, don't bring you into it. Bring somebody else in. Bring a defender in. We tend to find we get better shift of attribution if we get the person to bring themselves in. And sometimes you'll hear someone, like when I talk about Karen in a minute, one of the key things was, she said, my mum's twice my size. Oh, that's okay. What do you need? A gun? Dogs? It's your image. You can do it any way you like. Body armor, other people, any way you want to. In the end, she said, no, I'm going to do it myself. But she was very brave like that. And if you look through the literature on imagery rescripting, as I say, there are different protocols from different people. Marianne Layden's one, Barturia Hanian's, Smucker's. There's a whole raft of different ways of addressing this stuff. Jeff Young has been using it along with Arno Arntz. The key thing is we want the person to be dipping into that encapsulated memory. We want to be getting the person to review what happened to them, not as an adult, but as a child, and then come in with the adult perspective. So my way of looking at this is to say, well, what we're going to do is we're going to try to get you in your child mode. I'm going to try to get you to unravel some of that belief system, some of the feelings, etc., and then we'll bring in the adult to see whether the adult can help you make new sense of it from a more verbal perspective, more cognitively. So broadly, that's what we're doing, and I'll take you through what we do in just a second. Critical bit, we're looking for changes in attribution. What I want, of course, is the person to realize that it doesn't have to be about you that did it. It's not, I'm to blame for the problem. It can be somebody else is to blame. And this is where it's really important we bring that adult self in to bring in the adult perspective, a more logical perspective. So let's imagine, Bennett, sorry. I think I pressed a button that I wasn't meant to press there. Yeah. Let's go back to my good mate Karen. Okay, she was a lovely woman, etc. A bit challenging to work with, but great. Got her to eat. She was doing fine. She was down to binging once a week. That Friday evening, when she would push her boyfriend out to go be with his mates, etc., she would binge that evening. We could work out what the Newton's cradle looked like, but what she couldn't do was see that there was anything wrong with her conclusion that people will always dump her, that she was going to get abandoned and that emotions weren't safe. So what we started out with was talking to her about invalidating environments. That was really powerful for her because she'd never thought before about the way in which your family could have that effect without it seeming like it was something chaotic and kind of rogue. And lots of people can understand when the family has been a chaotic, emotionally abusive one. When it's been that more typical or perfect family, it's actually quite hard to spot because it's always easy to think, oh, well, my parents have my best interests at heart. And I remember a patient a little while ago saying, well, I'm sure my parents only sent me to boarding school because they have my best interests at heart. And about 6 months later, she's going, I've been arguing with my parents about why they just sent me to boarding school to get rid of me. And I was thinking, yeah, that's probably a better perspective on it from her point of view, because she could now say it was my parents, not me, that needed the boarding school, but they wanted rid of me for several months at a time. Anyway, so we do the psychoeducation about invalidating environments. We talked about how Karen's mum wasn't great at giving positive regard and how she expected everybody to be just snap to it, we're going to get on with things. And she always thought that was something to do with, dad's gone, therefore we've got to get through all this. But later on, she came to say, actually, mum's still like that now. We then did the historical review, put it into context. We got the story about her and her brother being left for weekends on time, weekends at a time. We got the whole story about the big event around mum slapping her. And then we went for evidence gathering. Do those beliefs that you developed make sense now? And of course, what we've got getting in the way here is the pro-schematic behavior. Well, my boyfriend and I argue every Friday, so I know he's going to leave me. You might be thinking, he's arguing back because he doesn't want to go out. He doesn't want to be told to go, etc. He doesn't want to be told never come back again, go off with your floozy. But she's interpreting him going as being evidence that he's going to abandon her. I'm interpreting it as he's been kicked out the door. I can't just tell her that she's got it wrong because she might not have. We then did some work on challenging her attributions. Where do you think that this died on its arse, frankly? Much so I'd love to say we got part of the way there. She just could not get the idea that any of the problems might be anything other than being down to her being someone who deserved people to leave her, and that her emotions were dangerous. She couldn't get past that belief based on the kind of more verbal discussions that we were having. No, that's okay. It happens sometimes. That's usually my big cue that says, let's get the imagery rescripting going. So what I did was, towards the end of a session where we've been trying the attribution work, I said, tell you what, next time I want to spend about half an hour working on this using this visual method. And I don't know if it'll work for you, but I'd like to give it a try because I think it might help you. I explained what it would involve, asked her to pick a particular event and come back next time with it ready. She came back next time and we're on to step 5. We're into imagery rescripting. Now, here's how it would go. And again, you can see video if you want to see this in more detail. Very first step with the imagery rescripting. Okay, what's the big event going to be? And the big event was not going to be the first time mum had left, which I thought it might be. It was the incident outside the police station where mum collected the kids after the whole string of misadventure had been discovered, and then slapped Karen. That was the big one. That's where she lost her faith that there was any way out of this. She'd been surrounded by all these adults who could have stopped it, and none of them did. I can't help thinking, all the way through, I was thinking, did nobody think about social services at this point? But apparently not. Anyway, so we agreed what the target was. And what I said was, okay, well, let's start the story somewhere. Where do you want to start it? What's a good point? And we started off in a police cell, as you do. I said, okay, tell me about the police cell. The police cell was where she and her brother got taken after they'd been discovered. I won't go into how they were discovered, but suffice to say it was an aunt who had their best interests at heart from the sound of it. They're in a police cell. Now, what I want to do is, of course, I want to wake up as much emotional and as much perceptual stuff as possible. So I'm asking questions like, how did it feel to be in there? What could you see? What could you smell? Tell me about the policewoman who's in the room with you. Were the doors closed? What color were the walls? So what I'm trying to do is build a good visual perceptual image and look at the emotions that she and her brother were feeling. What were you feeling? Well, I was really scared. How are you coping with that? I was hiding under the table with my brother. And where was the policewoman? Well, the policewoman had hold of my hand, and that felt good. Okay, so you had something that was making you feel good at the time. Yeah, I did. Was it cold? Was it warm? It was a bit chilly. What could you smell? Smell bleach, etc. And then after a couple of minutes, we move on to the next bit of the image, which is, and then I hear a noise. And the noise is Mum coming into the police station shouting at people. And my brother and I, you can see he's looking scared. I'm feeling really scared at the time. Tell me a bit more. What's the policewoman doing? Oh, she's now talking to a policeman who's come to the door of the cell, which is open. And what could you hear at the time? Could you just hear this voice getting louder and louder? How was your body feeling? Oh, I felt really, really tense because I knew Mum was going to be so angry. Okay, and we carry on like this, and then they took me and my brother down the corridor after Mum had gone quieter, and we met her in the lobby of the police station, and the policeman is telling her off, etc. And she's saying it will never happen again, and I'm holding on to my brother. What could you see? It's a big area, big screens, etc. Okay, so what happened after that? Well, after that, Mum, this is going to take me about 15 minutes. As I go through it and get her to give me detail. After everything else, the policeman says something quite stern to my mum, and then she takes us out. I'm on her right hand, she's holding my left arm. My brother's on her other hand, and she's pulling us out. How does that feel? Well, it really hurts my arm because she's really dragging my arm along, and it feels like I'm pulling it out of the socket. Okay, and how's that making you feel? I'm making me feel really scared because I don't know what's going to happen next, but it doesn't feel like it's going to be good. Remember, we're all the time trying to get into that very encapsulated memory in a very very perceptual, emotional way, not the kind of verbal, does it make sense that she was really pulling your arm out kind of way. Okay, so we get down there. How's your brother? He's crying. How are you? I'm trying not to cry because, my brother's scared enough as it is. Okay. So what happens next? And then we get to the point where Mum kneels down and, I'm not sure what she's going to do. And then she just suddenly slaps me across the face, tells me never tell anyone about this stuff again. And we never talked about it again, but she went back to traveling off for the weekend, the very next weekend. And that's where I'll probably say, okay, look, let's stop that image right now. Or I should have said earlier, by the way, a lot of clinicians, when they do this, ask the patient to close their eyes. When I'm online, I'll do that. When I'm in the same room as the patient, I always feel a bit wary about that. There's something about being a big male in the room with usually a young female that makes me think this is a bit too creepy. If the patient naturally closes their eyes, fine. But otherwise, I always feel I don't want to put them on edge, if that makes sense. So, if you've got your eyes closed, let's open them up. Tell me, how are you feeling right now? I feel, really, really sad about it. Who do you think was responsible for all that went on? Oh, I was. I was obviously just not being good enough. I hadn't kept my brother at home properly. I let us get discovered. I let the police take us away, etc. It was my fault that happened. Now, that's just that big attribution that we've already encountered, writ very large. And that's the thing that we want to see change. So, okay, so you're blaming yourself for this one. What I want to do now is I want to go back into that image, start from the beginning again. And I'm going to get you to go through it one step at a time. So we're back into that first room. Tell me, what kind of light fittings were there? What was your brother wearing? What were you wearing? Notice I'm trying to bring in more material together, thinking, what was it like? More perceptual stuff, not just going over the same stuff as she did before. So I'm not asking, I'm asking about light fitting, not whether she's under the table, that sort of thing. It's all just to keep it fresh for her. And again, how are you feeling at that point? How are you feeling at that point? And we go through the whole image again. Only this time, when we get outside the police station, and Mum's just beginning to kneel down to it, I say, right, let's stop there. Let's freeze it. What Chris Fairburn used to call press the button on the DVD, if anyone has DVDs apart from me anymore. Let's press the button on the DVD. Let's pause. Now, I want you to walk into this same scene as the adult you right now. Again, she can bring other people or a dog or something if she wants to, but she just wanted to walk into it herself. Okay, now you're the grown up in the room. Tell me, what are you going to do to look after young Karen and her brother? And you get this sudden change of style. If it's going well, what you'll see is the person who was feeling really beaten and battered before is now going, well, first thing I'm going to do is I'm going to pull mum's arm back so she can't slap her. I'm going to take mum to one side, by the throat if necessary. I think she did actually say I'm going to grab her by the throat and pull her off to the side of the police station. I'm going to talk to her where the kids can't hear me, and I'm going to tell her that she can't be such a bad mother, that this is her fault. She can't blame the kids for this. She's the one who went away. She's the one who's being a bad parent, and just trying to dump it all on the kids. Totally unacceptable, not good enough. And then I'm going to tell mum to, well, let's say go away, though the term was a little stronger at the time. I'm going to tell her to go away and don't come back until she's able to be a good parent. And if she can never be a good parent, just don't come back. And these are her terms, not mine, but pretty strong. And then it's, okay, so what else do you want to do? I want to go back to the kids. I want to let them know it's okay. I want to let them know they're safe, that they're not going to get shouted at. We're going to go and get, a juice or something. We'll have a chat. We'll get some food. I'll take them for a nice walk in the park. And then what we'll do is we'll play for a while, and then I'll take them home and make sure they're okay. And if mum comes back and she's still being the same, I'm going to kick her out the house. Okay, so we talk through this. We might get to the cafe. How's the young Karen feeling? She's feeling a lot calmer. Things feel a lot safer to her, etc. Okay, now let's come out of that image. Let's stop that image right there. Come out of it and tell me a couple of things. One, how are you feeling right now? And if you've done this right, if the patient has really engaged with it, first answer is likely to be, I feel exhausted. Because basically you've had their adrenaline running for the last 20 minutes or so. And it's amazing how often they come out saying, I'm exhausted. I totally wiped out by that. Okay, so you're feeling wiped out. I can understand why, because it's a lot of adrenaline to get through, because we're tapping into your emotions here. Tell me, who was to blame for all that happening? Oh, mum was. And this is where you're starting to get that attribution shift real fast. And it's a big thing with imagery rescripting. It's at its most powerful when you get this big attributional shift. It wasn't Karen who was to blame for it. It wasn't her brother. It was mum. Okay, so mum was to blame for that. Yep, absolutely. No question about it. It was mum who had created the problem. Mum was responsible for it going wrong. It wasn't Karen at all. And at that point, we usually say, okay, so what I want you to do is go away and look at whether there are other examples like that and think your way through them in the same way. Other examples where, for example, your dad left and your mum blamed you, things along those lines. And I want you to go through thinking with this same adult head on, who was to blame for that? The benefit of this is that it helps the person to understand really quickly that my emotions actually are things that are about somebody else's behavior. It's okay to feel angry because I was treated in a way that made it okay to be angry. And it's okay to express that anger. It's okay to express the loneliness, the shame, whatever it might be. I don't then need to find ways of blocking that emotion out. Is that making sense to people? Because what we find at this stage is usually those remaining binges, maybe bar one or two, which I'll come back to, drop off like a stone. We see them going real fast because you get somebody who makes a really transformative emotional shift in this. I'd love to say that was something we invented or something that only we get. But actually, if you look at the wider literature, people like Varturia, Hannian, Merce, Smucker, etc., they get just the same pattern of results. So this is something that is really powerful, really useful, and it's quick, which is, guess what, why we adopted it for the 10-session therapy. However, it's not everything, because there's one final step. Do you remember I talked earlier about pro-schematic behaviors, the way that Karen would try to kick her boyfriend out of the house, etc., because that fitted with her belief, I'm going to get dumped, let's just get it over and done with. It's also important, as much as you can, to get counter-schematic behaviors going. So what we agreed with Karen was actually maybe it'd be a good idea not to act like your beliefs were true. So what might you do that would help you to change those beliefs? And I remember thinking, I wonder if she'll want to go and talk to mum and to find out from mum. She said, actually, I could talk to my mum about this, but she couldn't make sense of this. She wouldn't accept it was anything to do with her. Okay, in that case, we're not going to do that, are we? So what could we do? And what we ended up agreeing on one course of action, and then she undertook a completely different one as well. So what we agreed was she would talk to her boyfriend about why she had been behaving the way she had been, not in a I'm to blame for it, but just say, in the therapy we've been talking about this, and I've realised that there's a reason I do this stuff. So not saying I am to blame for everything in the world, but just saying there is a reason. And she did this over the coming week, and she got a really confusing reaction because the boyfriend said to her, "Well, I wondered whether it was something like that, but I never liked to say, because it would have been getting emotional, and she didn't do emotions." Okay, I get that one. However, he also said something that really baffled her, which was, well, in that case, look, if we're going to try doing the things differently, do you mind if I don't go out every Friday? What do you mean don't go out every Friday? I go out on a Friday most times because you tell me to get the hell out of the house. Again, I'm paraphrasing the terms here. And it turned out that her pro-schematic behavior was driving the schemers, even though he was finding it really irritating because, as he said, they're just people at work. I don't want to go out with them every week. So what we started seeing was some big behavioral changes just out of one conversation that she had with him that were helping her to feel much more secure in the relationship. The other thing she did, which again, I wish I'd invented, but she came up with it all on her own. She went and talked to her brother. Remember the younger brother, 2 years younger? She'd always been aware that he had mental health problems. She had never understood why, and neither of them talked about this sort of stuff. And it turns out he'd had much more, if you like, immediate visible distress. He got angry, but he got angry externally. She would beat herself up. He would beat up other people. So he would say, I've never managed to have a relationship because of what she was like. He'd already worked out it was about what mum had been like. But that came as a real shock to Karen, who was absolutely sure all the problems in the world had been her. So actually going out and getting further evidence is a great counter-schematic behavior in this particular instance. Is that making sense to people? That we don't just stop when we've done the cognitive thing, we want to start reinforcing it. Is that okay? Any questions at this stage? Yeah, Wendy, go for it.
It's more of a reflection than a question, but it is a sort of question. I mean, having done sort of like previous rescripting work, like in PTSD and things, it can get very, very kind of tense in the room, kind of thing, and it can go on for a little while. I mean, is there a particular way that a therapist can be quite boundaried so that it doesn't become completely kind of uncontrollable, if you know what I mean? Does that make sense, Glenn?
I think it does, and that's why I always scope out the script beforehand. How long are we going to talk? We'll talk for about 15 minutes about it, and then we'll do another 15 minutes, then a 15-minute bit of debriefing to start planning some homework, etc. And I always keep the time going. So, okay, we're 5 minutes into this. Sorry, I should have mentioned that earlier. We're 5 minutes in, but we've got plenty more time to talk about it, etc. And I start winding it up with the patient when there's still good time to do that. You're right, it does get emotionally very hot for the person, but that's not that surprising. If I turn the kettle on, that gets hot as well. What we have to do is be good at making sure that we don't let it become essentially an open-ended rant.
Yeah.
But it's constantly bringing it back to where can we go now? So you're directing people in the way they're going. PTSD can be really tricky because sometimes what people do, and I doubt this is what you've done, but I've seen it happen. People say, tell me about your trauma. And they get the lot. everything, 20 years of trauma or 5 years of being in the army, they get a whole raft. I always say, let's pick one incident. And the real nice bit about that is once you teach the person the skill, actually, I very rarely ever had to do this more than once with one patient. Because they learn. I get them coming back saying, you know what, I've realized I do this as well, but I've been thinking about it. I don't think that was about me. So I don't know if that gives you an idea, Wendy, about that, those boundaries.
It does. No, it's helpful. Thank you. Yeah.
And if you've never done imagery scripting, you will feel absolutely freaked by it the first time you do it. But always look out for that. I feel exhausted. That says you've really hit the adrenal glands, and that's a good thing in these cases because you get a lot of exposure going on. But it also is critical to look at the change in the attribution and to explore that with the patient afterwards. So just remember that one. It's not just tell me the story, it's let's re-script it in a way that's helpful for you. Okay, what I want to do now, just looking at the time, yes, I can do this bit now. Remember what I said before, we have a third thing that can trigger you towards binging, and that's cue learning. Now, cue learning is something we see a bit in our patients, and it's about this diagram. I often draw this diagram out for my bulimic patients, binge eating disorder patients at the beginning. Remember, we started out dealing with the starvation. We then moved on to look at your emotional distress, some of that imagery re-scripting, the reattribution work, but maybe occasionally you still binge and it feels very much like a habit. You can't pin it down to an emotion. It's when you're well nourished, and it's here, exposure or availability. There's a fourth factor, which is disinhibition, which can come into this, but that's more, well, this is going to sound like a bit of cultural weirdness. I do a supervision for a group of people in Toronto. Almost everybody that they see has a major cannabis problem. Oh, no, that's not fair. They've got a major cannabis habit. And that seems to disinhibit lots of them to the point where they carry on binge eating because they don't bother eating properly. It's a way of dealing with emotions, etc. But disinhibition in general can be when you're tired, when you're dissociated. It can be when you're drunk, when you're stoned, whatever it might be. But the one I want to focus on right now is the one we can do something about, and that's exposure. Exposure to the cue. Now, why is this an issue? Because sometimes what we do is a habit, a good old-fashioned habit, and we need to help the patient learn how to deal with that. So these are the stubborn last binges. Sounds like a soap advert, doesn't it? We want to stop it because there is a big thing. Remember, people who keep binging tend to relapse. We don't want the relapse. Let's not have that. So this might occur one time in 5, maybe one time in 10 in the patients your supervisors work with. But you'll see a binge that you just can't make sense of, and it's a big risk for relapse. So we want to do something about it. This is where Pavlovian conditioning comes in. You remember Pavlov? Dogs, bells, food, etc. There probably never was a bell in Pavlov, but we talk about it, so I'll carry on. And what we get are contextual cues that are tied to your patient's prior binging. So when did you binge, etc.? Under what conditions? So if you binged for years of your life at 6 o'clock in the evening, or if every time you saw chocolate you ate it, what you start doing is developing this Pavlovian conditioning of see it, eat it, or time of day, eat it. And we get people who will say, I get this, I'll sit in my favorite chair, I'll turn the lights down, I'm watching a movie, and I get this overwhelming urge to eat. And that's because in that context, you've often eaten, half your body weight in popcorn or something like that. In short, we're trying to break patterns of association. My example is here on the right. This is the menu from my local Indian restaurant, or South Indian restaurant. It's great. They do wonderful vegetarian food. It's a place that we all tend to go when we're going for any kind of work do because the food is so good. But nowadays, even looking at the menu, I can feel a bit of saliva. Picking up the menu, the minute I pick up the menu in the restaurant, that's it. I know I'm going to be eating. I get the smells, I know I'm going to be eating. So I'm not actually eating. I'm just picking up all the cues for it. And what I need to do is break that cue. So, for example, if every time I binge, every time I smell cake, I eat the cake, then it becomes a kind of much more Pavlovian piece of conditioning. In other words, I'm going to keep doing that regardless of any other bits of more kind of verbal learning. So this is very perceptual in nature. They're not driven by energy needs, but they are driven by the cues to when we eat and what we eat. So here we go. It's Friday. You may not have been aware of that. You may be thinking I've got another couple of days to go, but it's Friday. It being Friday, you might have a particular food that you are likely to eat. It might be a takeaway, your special reward for it being Friday. Anyone got a food like that they will routinely eat on a Friday evening? And I am aware wine can count as a food in this context. If you have, you may well find that you're not even thinking about it, but come 6 o'clock, you've opened a bottle of wine, you've picked up the takeaway menu, you've called the kids and said, we're going to get a takeaway. This is because the context is cueing you towards a particular pattern of behavior. In other words, it's just standard Pavlovian conditioning. We all do it. So at 6 o'clock, I need some food. It's 6 o'clock on a Friday. I'm not bothering to cook. I'm going to get a takeaway. That's the kind of thinking that goes on. And it's not a great level of thinking. It's just what we used to. So what we're talking about is the environmental cues predict eating, and that kicks off your desire to eat, the digestive process, etc. Kind of things we see: smelling of food, seeing a food, touching or tasting a food, physical location, your time of day where you've previously binged, physiological states, other cues like what you're wearing, what TV show you're watching. I remember a colleague of mine saying they absolutely could not watch the evening news without having a glass of wine. If they didn't have a glass of wine in their hand, they'd feel uncomfortable and they'd miss the start of the news while they opened the bottle of wine to get a glass out of it. And that's quite a kind of reasonable human being. It's not nothing terrible, I promise you. So cue exposure is something where what we want to do is not eat the food. We want to confront the cues. So this is the one time we use exposure where we're not saying eat the thing you're afraid of. What we're saying is don't eat it. We're going to prevent the binge eating so that you learn, actually, I can look at the cue, I can look at the chocolate, etc. And you know what? I don't have to eat it. And that's a really important thing for people to learn. But it takes your ability to tolerate the craving until it's gone away. So instead of it binging on lots of food because it's Friday or because it's donut night or whatever it might be, what we're looking for is, can I sit there and not just avoid the food, but be around the food and not eat it? And that's a real skill. We have to teach our patients. So we want the patient to be eating normally first. We want the emotional triggers to be addressed. And what we want to do is push the patient to experience the physical state, but prevent the binge, not prevent the safety behavior. We've got to be able to explain it to patients. We've got to be able to explain it to our supervisees and to our colleagues. And it's often paradoxical compared to what other people have recommended. This came up yesterday with a patient where I was doing supervision. And the trainee was saying to me, the problem here is this patient has been told never, ever go anywhere near chocolate. Now, never, ever go anywhere near chocolate. It's like saying, so chocolate is now going to be this forbidden food that will always be on your brain. Every time you think about chocolate, you're going to be worrying about it. You're going to be thinking about it. And then one day you're just going to buy a bar of chocolate and eat it all. You're not developing control. It's like those addiction models that say, stay clear of alcohol forever. Don't go near the pub. Whereas other models, slightly more sophisticated, say, actually, if you want to get around being alcoholic, you've got to be able to go to the pub, but not drink. And that's the critical thing that we're looking at here. You've got to be able to be around chocolate and not eat it. or around the bottle of wine and not drink that. I'm aware that's very cruel of me. Sorry, it's Friday. I shouldn't mention bottles of wine over there. Yeah, Friday. I'm just looking at the time. If I can get this one to play, actually, I'm going to show you this because this is going to be the one thing that you probably haven't used before, and I'd like you to see it. So, assuming that I've got the sound working this time, what I'd like you to do is to watch what happens here when I get Jess, who's got, 10, always wants to eat chocolate when she sees chocolate. I'm going to try to get her used to the idea of you can be around chocolate, you can smell the chocolate, you can load up your senses, but you're not going to eat it, and see what happens to your urge then. Okay, and this is a realistic kind of period of time. About 15 minutes, you start seeing these urges go down. So if I just, please tell me if you can't hear this, okay? Otherwise, I'm going to turn off my camera and play this for you. Okay, Jess, now, last time you told me that you still get this craving to binge on some foods, particularly chocolate, as I remember it. And can I check? Can you hear that okay? Great. Okay, back we go. We've already been through all that stuff about making sure you're not starved, and that's fine. You've done really well on that for the last half dozen sessions. We've also looked at the emotional triggers to your overeating, and we're not identifying those as being issues here. So you've got much better at dealing with the emotions, but, and this is the important bit, you still get that craving. Is that a fair summary?
Yeah, I notice when I see or smell that like chocolate and stuff, I'm not hungry, or I'm not upset, and I still just want to binge on them straight away.
Now, can you remember the last time that happened? Can you just describe it for me?
Yeah, I mean, it was probably even just like last week, just like sat down to watch TV and just, fancied a little something. Wasn't hungry. It was just, I just wanted a little snack whilst I was watching TV, and just got some chocolate out. I can't remember what it was. It might have been truffles or something. And just ate the whole box, and I just couldn't stop myself. Like, as soon as I opened them, I could just smell that chocolate straight away, and yeah.
Okay, now that's a really good example. This is something that we call cue learning. In psychology, it's related to what we call Pavlovian conditioning. Now, Pavlovian conditioning is when you experience kind of a natural trigger in your life, and that triggers a natural response. I won't go into the technical terms for these, but what it means is that, for example, if you go to a restaurant, and it's your favorite restaurant, and you know what you want to eat, you pick out the menu, you have a look at it, and the minute you see the food, just describe the menu, you start to salivate. Does that sound familiar?
Yeah, makes sense, yeah.
Now, that's a natural preparatory thing. That's your body getting ready to eat something because it knows that under those conditions, food is going to be coming. Okay, now, when Pavlov did this, he did it with dogs, and he got them to expect food to come when they heard a particular noise, for example, and he tested out, and they learned to salivate in response to that noise. And what you're doing in the restaurant is responding to, here's the menu. And when you get that smell of chocolate, that's what you're responding to. Not to hunger, but to all the cues that say, here's a menu, or here's the smell of chocolate. We're going to eat. But part of this kind of conditioned learning that lots of people have. But in your case, it's something where it's become very automatic, and we need to get you used to not pairing up those things like the smell of the chocolate with actually eating the chocolate. I want you to be able to identify that you can smell chocolate without having to eat it. Does that make sense?
Yeah, that makes sense, yeah.
Okay. So last time I asked you to bring along something that was a typical food that would give you that urge to overeat even when you weren't hungry. What have you brought along?
I bought chocolate truffles.
Chocolate truffles. Have you got them with you at the moment?
Yeah, they're just here in a little box.
Okay, that's great. You're going to need two things. Number one of the truffles, and number two, a piece of kitchen towel, something you can kind of make a bit of a mess on.
Yeah.
You got both of those?
Got some, yeah.
Great. Okay. So what we're going to do is expose you to the sensations around the scary food, but without eating the scary food, which is, by the way, going to prove frustrating as well. Just thought you'd like to know.
Mm-hmm.
So can you get out one of the truffles and put it right slap bang in the middle of that paper towel in front of you?
Got one.
Okay, that's great. Now, what I want you to do is first experience it in as many sensory ways as you can. So the very first thing to do, I'd like to pick up a truffle. I don't have one here to show you, but and just hold it under your nose and smell it. Okay, now keep smelling it and describe what you can smell to me.
I can smell chocolate, and I think this one's an orange one as well, so I can smell orange chocolate.
That's the kind of thing you would normally find yourself eating just because it was there.
Yeah, definitely. Yeah.
Keep smelling, keep smelling. Okay, and now while you're smelling it, I want you to rub your fingers over it so you can get the texture of the outside of it. So keep the smelling going as well. I want to maximize all those sensations for you. Okay. And now what I want you to do is I want you to poke your tongue out and just rub it over the end of your tongue so you can taste the taste but not actually eat the food. Okay. Describe what that's feeling like.
I can taste that it's like got a cocoa powder on the outside, like a dusty chocolate. So I could taste that, and that's what I can feel as well on my fingers. Yeah.
How's that urge to eat it?
I want to eat it. Yeah, especially because I've just tasted that bit of chocolate.
Okay, so if we put that on a 1 to 10 scale, where 10 is definitely want to eat it now, and 1 is not really bothered, where would it be?
About a 10. Yeah.
I want you to do some more licking of the chocolate, some more feeling, rub it between your hands, whatever it is that will bring the sensations alive for you. Okay, keep looking at it and keep smelling, obviously. Okay, again, have another taste of the outside, again without eating it. Okay, so is that feeling fairly intense right now?
Yeah.
That's how it should be. And that's the link that people keep going with the smelling. That's the link people often start forming and think, okay, now I've got to eat the food. Now, what I want you to do next, this is why I want you to have that piece of towel, is I want you to stick your finger into the truffle. So just crack open the shell of the truffle.
Okay, I've done it.
Okay. Now, bring it up to your nose again. Let's see it. Yep. How does it smell right now?
Really orangey. I think all the middle's orange chocolate. Like, smells really chocolatey, really orangey.
Okay. How's that sensation of 1 to 10? I want to eat it all the way through to I'm not bothered.
I think it's still quite a 10 right now. The smell's just got quite a bit more intense as well.
Okay, well that's the point. That's what we want to do. I want to keep that 10 going, so you can realise it's possible to experience all of these things and still not have to eat. Okay, but sometimes what I'll ask people to do is also, while they're doing the smelling, is to ask you to imagine you're in a chocolate factory and imagine that there's rivers of chocolate running around, etc. So can you get that image into your mind?
Yeah.
Okay. Maybe just run your finger over the inner surface. Tell me how that feels. Don't eat it, but you can lick the end of your finger when you've got the chocolate off it. And tell me how it tastes as well.
Really good. It's like caramelly and soft and gooey.
Okay. This is usually the point where people start saying they hate me for getting to do this. How's that going for you?
Yeah, I've just tasted the inside and I would really like to eat it.
Back to smelling it, okay? And again, maybe have a taste of the very outside of the shell. But that's as much as I want you to actually eat, okay? I want you to show me that after a while, you're able to say, okay, do you know what, I'm a bit tired of this. And now that's going to take a while, but it will happen if you keep the sensation going. So again, tell me about the smell. Tell me about the associations that you make with that smell. Where would you normally expect to have it? What conditions would you normally be opening these chocolates in?
Normally be when I guess I'm like I said, watching TV, relaxed, ready to enjoy them. And yeah, I can just smell them so much now. And still thinking of that chocolate factory.
Now try picturing yourself not in the chocolate factory, but in your front room watching the TV. Okay, and again, have a smell. Tell me about the images that are in your head right now.
I'm just relaxed. I guess by this point I'd be making my way through them because they're just obviously really tasty, smell great. Mm. Mm-hmm.
But what we are saying is it's important that you only eat them when you choose to do so, rather than being this automatic Pavlov's dog type reaction. They're there, I can smell them, I must eat them. So it's more about establishing conscious control. It's not about taking away chocolate truffles from your life.
Mm-hmm.
It's about saying, instead of eating them automatically, be able to savor and enjoy them. Okay, and how's the smell right now?
It still smells good, yeah. I feel like I'm getting a bit more used to the smell though.
Okay. As orangey as it did when you first opened it, or less so?
A bit less orangey now.
Okay. So on that 1 to 10 scale, how big is I must have this and eat it right now?
I'd still definitely like to eat it, but maybe more like an 8.
Let's keep it going for a bit, because the lower down you can get that, the better, because it gives you more control in the long run. It feels horrible to have to do this right now. So again, tell me what kind of, if you were eating these, would you be in company? Tell me about what kind of people would be around if you're eating these, or would you only be doing it on your own?
I'd probably just be doing it on my own. I think I'd feel too embarrassed to eat the whole box with other people, so I probably wouldn't get them out if I was sitting watching TV with other people. So I'd be on my own, yeah.
Let's imagine
Mm-hmm.
Let's imagine you're with other people. You've got a box of these chocolates, and you are going to offer them round. How would that feel?
I'd find it quite hard, obviously, because you open up the box and you can just smell them straight away. So I'd want to eat them, but I'd feel better if I was with other people and they were eating them. But like I said, I don't do that because I get the urge to just eat them all, and so I'd feel a bit maybe frustrated because I couldn't just eat them all.
If we can get you past the point where opening the box is a kind of command rather than a pleasure, then maybe you'd be able to do that. So if you're able to open the box and say, oh, that's lovely, rather than I must now eat them all, you could even go out there, you'd get the smell from the box and other people would get the chocolates along with you, I'm guessing. Does that sound like a reasonable thing to aim for?
Yeah, definitely. Yeah, I'd like that.
It's that more social element of eating, which is often when it is things like, pleasurable foods like chocolates and that sort of thing, or biscuits or whatever it might be. So again, how's the smell? Does it smell as orangey, as chocolatey as it did?
No, I feel like I'm getting a bit more used to the smell. It's not as intense anymore.
That's normal. It's even evolutionary, because if you smell something immediately, and it means something like I don't know, I can smell a bear, better run away, then that has function for you. But if you smell it and nothing bad happens, actually you don't need to act straight away. Just spend time on it. So the fact that your sensation is going down is a process called habituation. It's when the body gets used to a particular stimulus just being there and you don't notice it so much. It's like when you move into a new place, you might notice traffic outside the door, and a week later, you don't even notice it anymore. It's kind of like you've learned to tune it out. What you're doing is you're learning when there's no immediate panic about it, you can tune out some of the more, I must have it now, elements of the sensation of that chocolate. Is that making sense?
Yeah, definitely makes sense, yeah.
Okay, so tell me about the smell right now.
It's still it's a bit chocolatey, but yeah, nowhere near intense. And it's actually just getting way more melted now, so I'm not even really liking how it feels.
That's good. So on that 1 to 10 scale of I want to eat it right now versus I can take it or leave it, whereabouts are you at the moment?
Much further down the other end, take it or leave it. So like a 5, 4 or 5 maybe. Not really fancying this one anymore.
Okay, but it is worth remembering that one maybe feels a bit off because it starts to melt a bit. So what would be really helpful over this coming week would be if you could try that again, one chocolate at a time, and notice and keep a record of how strong that urge to eat was, both when you first started smelling and touching it, and by the time you got bored with it. And I think what you'll find is that the level of must have it now doesn't get to a 10. It kind of gets to a, yeah, it'd be nice, but it'll be somewhere in the middle. And it doesn't last so long either. Okay, this is that habituation process. This is you learning that the kind of particular cue you've got doesn't have to be associated with a particular response you've always had. Does that make sense?
Yeah, definitely makes sense. Mm-hmm.
Okay. In that case, homework is one of those per day. Okay, doing exactly what we've just been doing, and maybe how many are there in the box?
I think there's 12 maybe.
Okay, then maybe you should have maybe 5 at the end of the week, maybe rewarding yourself by just saying, and if I get to a point where I'm watching TV, maybe I'll eat one, but I won't eat it straight away. I'll get one, I'll put it on a saucer or something, or a piece of kitchen towel, and then half an hour later, maybe I'll eat it. I'll save it until the next advert break or whatever it might be. Does that sound okay?
Yeah, that sounds like a good idea, yeah.
Okay. Let's try doing that one, and we'll see how the ratings are going by next time. Okay, I mean, having watched that several times, I do get to the point where I'm beginning to think I never want to eat a chocolate again. But hopefully that gives you an idea about what is meant by the way that we use cue exposure, just flooding her with that sensation of, oh, yeah, I really want this. I really am getting bored with this. It's just a sticky mess. That's the approach that we use around. If it were an alcohol problem, we do the same thing. If it's a food problem, we do the same thing there. So I'm hoping that gives you an idea about what I'm talking about. Are there any questions about that before we go and have a well-deserved chocolate break? No. Okay. In that case, it's 22. Can we meet again at 3 o'clock? And then it's going to be body image all the way. Okay. I'll see you guys shortly. Okay. Bye for now.